Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bloomerang Academy. We're so glad that you're joining us today. If you would, please go ahead and drop into the chat. Let us know where you're joining us from and what the weather is like where you are today. Here in Indianapolis, it's actually 43 degrees and sunny. So we're having a really nice day. It's been quite warm here. And I know, Jesse, you're joining us from the West Coast. So what's it like out there today?
Yep, so a little bit west of Seattle, and we've got some winter storms coming in today. So a little rainy and a little gray, pretty normal for over here.
Yeah, the weather's all over the place. So just if you would share with us, it's always fun to see what it's like where people are reporting in from. So thank you. Oh, I see some people checking in. Thanks so much. We're going to go ahead and get started. So I do want to go through a few housekeeping items. This is our dial-in number in case you need it, so that if you lose audio or if you need translation services, this is the number you'd want to use: 1-669-900-6833, and I've dropped it into the chat as well, so you can grab it from there if you need it. A couple other housekeeping items. If you would like to have a live transcript, please feel free to click on the live transcript button on your toolbar. A couple of other buttons we want to talk about: the chat that you are so wonderfully using right now to report your weather and where you're joining us from is a great place to share best practices. Maybe you have ideas, things that you want to share with the group. It's a really great place for that. However, if you have a question that you really need answered, we ask that you drop that into the Q&A for us, please, because that makes it so that we are able to see it and it doesn't get lost in the chat. So that's just kind of the difference between those two. Also, I wanted to mention that all of the resources that are mentioned today will be linked. So we will be sharing those after the session, so later this afternoon. We're also going to share the slides and the recording of the session. So please don't worry about that. You will get all of this information later on today. Any questions we are not able to address live, we will follow up with you. So if it's getting towards the end of the session and you had a question in the Q&A and we weren't able to get to it, please don't panic. We will definitely follow up with an answer for you. But don't forget, if at any time you need assistance, our support team is amazing. Don't hesitate to reach out and contact them. They want to be able to help you as well. So today we are really fortunate to have with us Jessie Gilchrist. She's going to be talking about Bloomerang and Zapier, updating transactions in Bloomerang. So Jessie, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and steal the screen share here. Go ahead and it'll let me. Perfect. Well, thanks everyone for joining today. Again, as Margie just said, my name is Jessie, and I am a product manager and senior consultant here at Sidekick Solutions. Sidekick, we are a Zapier certified expert and Bloomerang integrations firm. So we've been a Bloomerang partner specializing in system automations and have been a Bloomerang user since about 2013, and we're a part of the team that launched the Bloomerang Zapier app. So lots of experience here with Bloomerang itself, as well as with the Bloomerang Zapier app. And so pulling that together today to talk to you about updating transactions in Bloomerang using Zapier. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my video off now that you've all seen my face. Since we'll be doing some live demos today, I want to make sure that you are able to focus on the screen share as we walk through these builds together. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my video off so we can focus on the content. The goal of today's webinar is to show how you can use the Bloomerang Zapier app and Bloomerang's API to update coding in Bloomerang following creation of a new transaction to support operational processes and free up more resource for fundraising and your programmatic efforts. Now, it's important to note before we dive into this webinar that some of the concepts in this webinar are more advanced. So we are going to be demonstrating how to make a custom call to Bloomerang's API, which is the backend code for Bloomerang, and using that to update a custom field on an existing transaction. So this is advanced functionality. If you have not watched any of our prior Bloomerang and Zapier webinars in Bloomerang Academy or are new to Zapier, you may want to watch those existing webinars first before watching this webinar, because they cover a lot of core concepts with Zapier. And I'm going to go ahead and send the links to those. Or whoops, here goes my camera. see if I can send the links to those here in our chat. Go ahead. So there's 3 Bloomerang Bloomerang and Zapier webinars that get us started on kind of exploring Bloomerang automations. And then there is a Zapier 101 and a Zapier 201. So again, if you haven't watched these webinars before, I recommend watching them as they're going to cover some of those foundational concepts that we will build on today. Again, these are all available in Bloomerang Academy and a great starting point. So if you haven't watched these, you can feel free to stay on the webinar here, but just know if there's some concepts that are new, it may help to go back and watch those webinars as well. So our webinar today, we're going to start by introducing Bloomerang and Zapier, how they work together, and why Zapier integrations are a key feature of your Bloomerang system and fundraising strategy. We're going to demonstrate how you can use the Bloomerang Zapier app to save time and energy by automating updates to constituent custom fields following new transactions. And we're going to demonstrate how you can use Bloomerang's API to update custom fields on the transaction after it's created. And then if we have time, we're going to wrap up by talking about how you can get started with Zapier integrations for Bloomerang. As I mentioned, we have demos throughout the webinar today to show how you can set up these automations for your organization. And again, we're happy to answer questions, so feel free to put those in the Q&A if you have questions, and we should have time at the end to cover some of those. Now, it's common for organizations of all sizes to use many types of software, and we believe that automated integrations are essential to your donor database. Integrations can help connect these systems, creating a tech stack that supports your organization and its strategic goals, and this is where Zapier comes in. As some of you may not be familiar with Zapier, we're going to start with a high-level overview of what Zapier is and why we believe it's a key feature of your Bloomerang system and your fundraising strategy. So Zapier is automation software that enables additional Bloomerang integration and fundraising opportunities. It's really a middleware that sits in between Bloomerang and other apps you use, helping them talk to each other. Bloomerang's Zapier app extends the power of your database by enabling integrations with over 5,000 other applications in Zapier's directory, including doing automations from Bloomerang back to Bloomerang, which is what we're going to be covering today. Now, Zapier is designed for anyone to build an integration, and you don't need to be a developer to be able to set up an integration in Zapier. The flexibility of the platform really enables you to create custom integrations where you aren't limited to a one-size-fits-all workflow, mapping, or formatting, and you can really build an integration that's perfect for your organization and your workflows. So again, today, we are going to demonstrate how you can use the Bloomerang Zapier app for updates in your database following a new transaction, and also showing how you can pair that with Bloomerang's API, that backend code of Bloomerang, to perform functions that are not currently included in that Zapier app. Now, integrations are a key feature of your Bloomerang database and can take your fundraising efforts to the next level. Data should flow in and out of your Bloomerang database, connecting it to other best-in-class tools your organization uses. And in this case, again, we are focusing on this green line right here, which is a Bloomerang to Bloomerang integration. But really, the mindset here is that Bloomerang should remain as the central hub of your tech stack, creating a global record of constituent engagement with data flowing into Bloomerang or out of Bloomerang as is needed. So Margie already went ahead and launched the poll. And so we want to do a quick poll before we go any further, just to get a sense of how many of you are familiar with Zapier, or maybe you currently have integration set up with Zapier right now. So go ahead and respond to that poll and let us know kind of what your experience with Zapier is, so we can get a gauge of where the room's at.
Like we have almost everyone. I'm going to end the poll and share the results, Jesse.
Perfect. Looks like some of you are new to Zapier, but haven't used it, or first time you're hearing of Zapier. Some use it today with Bloomerang. Perfect. And some obviously use it today, but not with Bloomerang. So for those of you that are new to Zapier, and this is the first time you're ever really getting that exposure to Zapier, or maybe you've heard of it but haven't set up automations, I really want to encourage you to think of today as kind of a brainstorming session to give you ideas for how you could automate some of those Bloomerang to Bloomerang processes that you may be doing on a manual basis right now. So while some of you may dive in and build the solutions we're going to talk about here today, DIY, for others of you, this may just be a great session to start those wheels turning of what automations are possible using the Bloomerang Zapier app as well as the Bloomerang API. Now, the first use case we want to focus on today can be accomplished using the Bloomerang Zapier app alone. And we want to start with this more basic kind of update flow before transitioning to a more advanced use case to really kind of set the stage again for what Bloomerang to Bloomerang automations can accomplish using Zapier. So we have encountered a number of organizations that like to flag a constituent as a donor and a custom field on that constituent's profile. We often see this field called donor type or donor status. And if a constituent's added to the database but is never given, perhaps they're marked as a prospect in this field. And then following their first donation, the organization is manually updating that field to indicate that the individual is now a donor. So this automation really accomplishes that process and takes that manual piece out of it. So every time a new transaction is created in Bloomerang, if the constituent is not already coded as a donor, the automation is going to update that custom field on the constituent's profile and flag that that individual is now a donor. So again, this is a very basic flow, but we want to start here just to show some of these how some of these manual processes you may be doing can be automated using Zapier. Now let's go ahead and hop into Zapier and actually into Bloomerang as well. I want to go ahead and show here the custom field we have set up for this. So I've got a constituent custom field here that I'm calling my donor type. And you can see that I just have a value for donor and a value for prospect. Again, constituents in this database are going to be coded as a prospect until they make their first donation, and then we want to change this to donor. So when we're in Zapier, the first thing that we're going to do in order to start building this automation is to click create. We could also click this orange create zap up here. Both are going to accomplish the same thing. But we're going to create our first zap or our first automated workflow. And this workflow is going to start with a new transaction in Bloomerang. That's what's called our trigger. So we're going to call this new donation. So let me change my name up here. Update donor type field. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm naming my automation. And then I'm going to choose Bloomerang as my application and my trigger right here. So that's our application. We want to trigger from Bloomerang, and we want to trigger every time a new transaction is created. So we're going to choose our new transaction, which is our triggering event. Now, the trigger is what prompts the integration to run when that event occurs. So in this case, every time a new transaction is created. And when we're setting up this trigger in Zapier, we're going to choose our Bloomerang account. I'm going to choose my sandbox I've got here. Now, we could set some parameters. So we could say that we only want this to run for certain transaction types. In this case, I'm going to set a minimum amount. So I'm going to say it needs to be a transaction record that's created that's at least a penny. We could set a maximum amount as well. We're not going to be doing this in today's webinar, but if you wanted to do a similar coding where you tagged a custom field as a major donor, when someone makes a donation over a certain amount, you could adjust this minimum amount to, let's say, $1,000 or $500 or whatever that threshold is that your organization uses for a major donor classification. And again, set up a similar flow to what we're doing today to code a custom field indicating that that constituent is now a major donor. So again, lots of variations that could be done to this flow we're creating here today. But today we're really focusing on someone's first donation. We want to make sure that they're coded as a donor. So I don't need to designate any type of transaction in this use case that we're using. I don't need a maximum amount. And I can leave these cumulative giving history and household information optional fields here. I can just leave these blank. We don't need to pull that information in for our automation. Now, the next step is to test our trigger and generate some sample data. So this is going to go, when I click test trigger, this is going to go to my Bloomerang database and return the 3 most recently created transactions. Now, these are samples only. They're not going to run through the integration because they were created before our integration is turned on, because these Zap triggers are only going to run in real time. When I pull in these samples, these give me a return or a payload of fields. See all of this data about the transaction. And if I go down, you can see that I also have details about the constituent as well. So pulls in all this information that I can use when I am setting up the subsequent steps in my automation. So once I have the sample transaction that I want to use, now I'm going to go ahead and create, if we go back to our workflow, I'm going to create my filter right here, which says my automation is only going to continue if this person is not yet already coded as a donor. So we're going to go back here and we're going to create our first action. So our trigger is our first step. Everything after it is called an action in Zapier. And I'm going to use Zapier's built-in tool for filtering. When I'm setting up my filter, I'm going to say that I only want, I only want my automation to continue if the constituent donor type right here. So I'm going to choose and select this field. This is pulling from the constituents details that were returned with my transaction. And I'm going to say if it does not exactly match donor. So again, this filter is a way of making sure my automation is only running for those constituents that I want it to update for. So I could add additional criteria here if I wanted to. But in this case, I want to say that I'm going to continue my automation if the donor type does not exactly match donor. And so I can click continue to test this, and it's going to confirm for me whether my transaction, the constituent with my transaction, would have passed through my filter or not. And you can see that it's confirming for me that my Zap would have continued because the donor type field for this constituent was empty. If it had been populated and it said donor, this actually would have said, it would have been yellow and it would have said your Zap would not have continued. So again, it's going to give us that validation when we're setting up our automation that our criteria is working the way we intended for it to. Now, after we've set up our filter, so we've got our new transaction trigger, we've got our filter to only continue if the constituent is not already marked as a donor. And then we're going to add our second Bloomerang step here. So it's going to be our Bloomerang action. And this is to update the constituent in Bloomerang to assign that field or assign that value. So I'm going to choose Bloomerang as my app, update constituent as my action. I'm going to choose my Bloomerang account. And the first thing we need to do is up here in this constituent field, if I click in here, you're going to see that it's going to give me a list of all of the constituents that are in my database in Bloomerang. If I were to select one of these, it would mean that every time my Zap runs, it's updating that specific constituent, which is not what we want to have happen. So we want to choose custom mapping right here. So you can see it says constituent or custom. We want to choose custom. And in our new transaction in Bloomerang trigger, we want to search for and select what's called the constituent ID. This is a unique ID for each constituent, similar to an account number, but this is what's used for Bloomerang integrations to identify which account we want to be updating. So we're going to map the constituent ID, and this makes sure that every time this automation runs for whatever transaction it was that triggered the automation, that we are going to update that same constituent. So if we wanted to mark a field or mark our donor type field as donor, if we come down here, I'm going to find, once I get past all my standard fields, you'll see I get into my custom fields here, and it's going to have the category name for the custom field and then the custom field name. So I've got my donor type field right here. And all I'm going to do is just select the value of donor. So this is called hard coding an integration, meaning we are putting or assigning a static value that every time this Zap runs, that is going to be the one that's assigned there. So every time this runs, again, if that constituent is not already marked as a donor, it's going to go ahead and flag that. And I can go ahead and click continue. And you can see we've got this here. We can test our automation to make sure this step would be successful. I can go ahead and test, and it's going to confirm for me. And because this constituent we pulled in isn't already coded as a donor, my test is going to update that information. So if I go to my Sherlock Gilchrist record in here, you'll see that by testing that step in my automation, testing and making sure we could assign that donor type, you'll see that Sherlock's profile, which didn't have a value when that transaction was created, is now coded as a donor in our donor type field. And I'm going to pause right here because I actually thought there was a really good question that came through, which was, will this work on a select multiple field without erasing the existing data in that field? For example, marking major donor on a constituent who's also marked donor. So the answer is yes, there are ways to do that. You actually need to map both of those values when you're doing that update step. So you likely would have two automations, one that's tagging them as a donor and then a separate automation that's tagging them as a major donor. But there are ways to map in the existing values as well as new values into that update constituent action, because the update constituent action for a custom field serves as an overwrite. So that means we need to map in the existing values as well as any new value we want to add to ensure that they, again, we keep that current coding as well as appending those new values. So yes, there is a way to do that. It does require the mapping again of both existing values as well as new values. If there's any other questions on this use case we've done right here, I'll give a minute before we transition on to the next use case, which is a bit more advanced. So I want to give a second here before we transition off. So any questions, send those in the chat or the Q&A real quick, and we'll get those addressed. Awesome. Thanks, Aaron. I'm glad that answered your question. Perfect. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions right now, so let's move on to the next use case, which is updating transaction custom fields. So again, as we head into this use case, we'd like to highlight that this is an advanced Zapier and integration concept. As we mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, the recording is going to be shared so you can rewatch alongside your own Zap build if desired. Because we're going to look at, in this use case, how to update a custom field on a transaction following the creation of a transaction. Right now, Bloomerang does not have an action in its Zapier app to update an existing transaction. Maybe added in the future, but it's not there currently. So in order to accomplish that action or that update feature for a transaction, we actually have to use the Bloomerang API. So while Zapier is a no-code integration builder, it does also allow us the flexibility that when we need to do a custom call to an API using some coding or some script, we can go ahead and do that in the Zapier platform. So we, again, today on this use case, are going to give you the script to use for this and want to make sure that you're able to, again, deploy this and have the resources too. But just know, again, going in, if this feels overwhelming, or it feels like it's going a little quickly, you will have the recording. You can watch it afterwards, side by side, as you try to build a similar automation for yourself. Now, it's common for organizations to configure their fund campaign and appeal fields in Bloomerang to align with development needs and or the use the terminology that's really specific to fundraising and does not always identify how the donation will align within the organization's own finance or accounting system. And we're seeing more organizations using a custom field to track the accounting or finance code that the transaction corresponds to. It can be time consuming to manage this field manually, especially when donations may be coming through online web forms, which may or may not code this field as well. So this automation is really driven off of this use case of a custom field that's tracking additional kind of transaction coding related to finance or accounting, and isn't something that's being manually entered by your team every time they're creating a donation. So really similar to the last flow, this flow is going to automate that manual process. So when a new transaction is created in Bloomerang, if there is no value in the general ledger code custom field, meaning that field is empty, the workflow is going to use the Bloomerang fund to look up the corresponding code that we'd want to assign there and update that in the transaction. So we're doing a little bit of this conversion as well, saying if we're coding it with this fund or this campaign or this appeal in Bloomerang, this is the kind of accounting or finance designation we'd want to attribute this to in our GL code custom field. So similar to our last flow, we're going to use a filter because we only want to go ahead and update transactions that aren't already coded. So in this case, using this filter is really with the assumption that at times your staff may be manually assigning a value in this field versus other times it's going to be empty and needs to be updated. Some organizations prefer to let the automation handle the coding of this field kind of across the board. And if that's the case, the filter isn't needed because every transaction should be coded using the automation. But in this case, using the filter allows your staff to manually code the field if they're creating a transaction in Bloomerang themselves and are coding that GL code field, and then essentially have the automation pick up the rest. So for those where either that coding was missed, or again, coming through an online web form where that custom field isn't being coded. It's important to note that the solution we're going to demo today supports a single transaction without any splits, as well as split transactions in Bloomerang. So the code that we're going to be sharing will work whether this transaction, again, is a single donation or pledge payment or recurring donation payment, or it's a split transaction. So we really wanted to make sure the code in the script that we're sharing with you today would work for all use cases. Again, whether you do split transactions or not. So just knowing that this will support both of those. And as well, if you chose to use, again, the Bloomerang campaign or appeal for this lookup or conversion we've got right here, the same flow could be applied, just using that different field for that conversion to what GL code should be assigned. So again, there's some flexibility and variation that could be done in this flow based off your organization's preference. But just know those are two pieces that, again, were accounted for in the solution we're going to cover today. So before we dive into actually building this automation, there are three things we need to do. Number one is we need to generate what's called our API key. This is a unique token for your Bloomerang database that allows us to set up that call to the Bloomerang API. And then we need to identify the field ID and the field value IDs for that custom field that we want to be updating. And if you're sitting here thinking this sounds advanced, again, it is, but we are going to walk it through step by step. So let's start with generating the API key. So the API key is a unique identifier that allows you to retrieve or write data to your Bloomerang instance using the API. So a good way to think of it is like a more secure form of your login credentials. And this key grants access to your full Bloomerang database, and therefore, once it's generated, should really be kept secret and stored securely, not shared obviously through email or any unsecure means, because that key would allow someone to access or write data into your Bloomerang database. Now, an API key for Bloomerang is tied to a Bloomerang user. So in order to ensure continuity with your automations, we recommend creating a user in your database and naming it Zapier. or something similar, and using a generic email for your organization, such as an info@company.org, IT@company.org, donor@company.org, whatever that is, kind of an organizational email alias to associate with that user, so that if you have staff turnover, it doesn't deactivate the API key, and then in turn also turn or cause your automation to fail. So again, when we're talking about integrations using the API, we recommend having a user in Bloomerang that is used specifically for generating your API keys. Again, so that when you do have that staff turnover, your integration doesn't stop running because that API key gets deactivated. So in order to generate your API key, you will log into Bloomerang and navigate to the user's settings. And you'll see that there is a section there called API Keys version 2.0. You'll click Generate. There'll be a pop-up that'll ask you to add a name for your API key. Again, put Zapier or something similar, and then click Generate again, and it will generate a long string of characters that is your API key. Again, the key should be kept secret and secure, because it does provision whomever has that would have the ability to access your Bloomerang database. But that would be how you generate your API key, again, which will be used in the call we will make in our integration to update the transaction in Bloomerang. So that's step one, is generating our API key. Step two that we need to do before we set up our integration is to retrieve the ID for the custom field that we want to update. So when we make a call using the Bloomerang API, we actually need to use the ID of the custom field, not the name that you've assigned to that custom field. So in order to retrieve the ID of the custom field, we just simply open up that custom field in Bloomerang to edit it, and you'll see that ID is up there in the URL. So you can see if I go to my Bloomerang instance here, and I go to my transaction custom fields, and I go to click on my GL code transaction custom field right up here. That is my ID for my custom field. So if I wanted to update the GL code custom field, I'm updating field ID 8403968. So this is where you will go to retrieve that ID of your custom field in Bloomerang. Now, similar to our API key, if we're setting this up in our own Zapier account, and we're setting up our automation, we will jot down our API key. We will jot down the ID of our custom field. And then the last thing we need to retrieve are the IDs for each of the values that we may want to assign in that field. So similar to the field itself, we have to assign the ID for the value we want to assign. So I can't assign or send 4100 unrestricted through my Bloomerang API call. If I want to assign that value, I need to send through 8404992. Now, the reason why the API does this is because you may rename your field or your field values, but that ID that's stored in the backend of Bloomerang, that never changes. So the use of this ID actually future-proofs your solution in case there's any naming changes to these values. Any changes to these values over time and how you are naming them or your naming conventions change, this will assure that you are still assigning that same value. So again, it may feel like a couple additional steps here, but really useful to ensure that one, your automation is going to be successful, but two, that regardless of whether you change the name of your custom field or the labeling of your field values, that you are still going to be successful. So while we can retrieve the ID for the field within Bloomerang, the best way to retrieve the IDs for the field values is actually within Zapier. So if I go back to Zapier here, and I'm going to go ahead and just create a draft Zap. So this is a Zap that we're never going to turn on. We are just going to use it to pull the IDs for our custom fields. And I'm going to skip over my trigger. I don't need to set up my trigger. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click action right here. And I'm going to choose Bloomerang and I'm going to choose create donation. Because what this is going to do is it's going to pull in all of my fields that are available on a transaction in Bloomerang, standard fields and custom fields. And if I come down to my custom field right here, my GL code, you can see that below each value, there's a little gray number, and that gray number is the API ID. So this is the value that we would want to use if we wanted to assign, again, that 4,100 unrestricted value in this custom field. We need to send in our call 840-4992. So again, step one is generating our API key. Step two is getting the ID for our custom field, so the ID for our geocode custom field. And then step three is retrieving the value IDs for each of the values that could be assigned in our custom field or that we want to assign in our custom field. Can't recommend enough getting these three pieces of information ready before you actually hop into Zapier to set up your automation, because it's going to make your actual setup of the automation a lot easier. Now, before we hop into Zapier to actually set up our automation for updating these transaction custom fields, I saw that Aaron had made a comment here. I appreciate the positive feedback about setting up Bloomerang user for Zapier. I also recommend using that same Zapier user in Bloomerang for connecting the actual Bloomerang Zapier app itself for the same reason. If you are using your own login credentials, so a Jesse Gilchrist login credential to connect Bloomerang to Zapier, even with the Bloomerang Zapier app itself, if my user becomes deactivated in Bloomerang, so does my connection in Zapier. So can't recommend enough having a specific user in Bloomerang that you call Zapier and use not only for connecting to the Bloomerang Zapier app itself, but also for generating that API key if you are going to do any of these automations that require the API. So again, one user can work for both types of integration concepts, but can be really helpful to, again, just future-proof in the face of staff turnover. Now we're going to hop in here and we're going to go ahead and get started on this automation. So this one we are working on, which is every time we have a new transaction, if there are no geo code values, we're going to look them up by the fund and then update our transaction in Bloomerang. So again, just giving a quick name to my automation so I know what it is when I look in Zapier. We're going to have the exact same trigger as we did for our last automation. So we're going to select Bloomerang. We're going to select new transaction. Choose our Bloomerang account. Enter our minimum amount again. In this case, we may want to set our types to just those that are revenue transactions. So donation, payment, pledge payment, really kind of organizational preference on that. We're going to test our trigger here to pull in a sample. Similar as before, it's going to pull in up to 3 of the most recently created transactions so that we can use them for mapping in our automation. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to come in with our filter like we did the last time. We're going to have different criteria this time, though. This time, instead of saying donor type does not match donor, in this time, we're going to say geocode does not exist. So down here is a do not exist, meaning this field is empty. So we're going to set our filter to only continue to update that field on the transaction if it's empty, meaning it wasn't coded by a member of your team or through another integration that's syncing the transaction into Bloomerang. So I'm going to go ahead and click continue to test my filter. You can see it wouldn't have continued because my geocode is actually empty here. So the first step we're going to do after our filter is we need to do this lookup. So we need to convert and tell our automation for each of the funds that we have in Bloomerang, what is the geocode value that we should be assigning when we update the transaction. So in this case, we're going to use what's called a lookup table in Zapier. So I'm going to click the little plus symbol. And I'm going to use another of Zapier's built-in tools. This time I'm going to choose format. Our event that we're going to choose is utilities right here. And you can see it mentions the lookup table in this description as well. And we're going to do a transform, and our transform is going to be a lookup table. Now, when it comes to doing a lookup table, the first thing we need to do is put in our lookup key. So in this case, this is going to be our Bloomerang fund. So I'm going to come in and I'm just going to search for the word fund, and I want my fund names right here. Now you can see that this transaction I've pulled in is actually split transaction. So there's 3 different splits: capital, unrestricted, and unrestricted are the funds that were assigned on those splits on my transaction in Bloomerang. But I'm going to go ahead and map in the fund name. And this action here, this lookup table, has what's called line item support, meaning each of those fund values here is going to get processed through this lookup and return the corresponding value ID that I want to assign in Bloomerang. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my lookup table. And when we set up a lookup table in Zapier, the field on the left, or the cells on the left, are going to correspond to the values that may come through our lookup key. So in this case, all of our Bloomerang fund values. And then on the right is going to be what we want to convert them to. So I've got 6 funds in Bloomerang. So I'm going to go ahead and just type in my fund names that I've got here in Bloomerang. And I want to match these to exactly how they're listed in Bloomerang. And what I'm going to do on the right here is this is where I'm going to put the corresponding ID for the value that I'd want to assign for each of those. So if it's going to be 4100 unrestricted, I'm going to assign 8404992. So I'm going to come in and just put those in. Go from here. Oops. Okay. So once I've got all of these in here, then I will go ahead and I will test my action. And the reason why is because I want to run this lookup table, convert this input that I have, and have it return that output value, which is those, you can see here, my value IDs that I want to assign on that transaction in Bloomerang. So it's going to go ahead and get me those. And again, I have a transaction here that has 3 splits on it, which is why you're seeing 3 values that are output. If you had a transaction that was just a single transaction, you would just see 1 value that's output here. But again, the code we're going to implement here in the next step to update that transaction is going to account for whether you have a single transaction or a split transaction. So the last step of our flow is to implement the call to the Bloomerang API that will update the custom field on the transaction. So in this case, we're going to add another step. And this time we're going to use another built-in Zapier tool, and this one's called Code by Zapier. So this is what allows us to implement a custom code script in any automation. So takes what is naturally a no-code integration builder in Zapier, but gives us some advanced functionality where we can do some kind of fancier things that may not be available in a Zapier app. So in this case, we're going to choose Run Python, which is a type of code language. And we're going to start by setting up what's called our input data. And there are three things we need in this input data. The first is our transaction ID, so the ID for the actual transaction. The other is the ID for our designations. That means the ID for each of the splits in a split transaction, or the resulting ID if it's just a single transaction. And then our values, meaning the values we want to assign when we are updating that transaction, what values we're assigning in that custom field. So I'm going to pull in my ID of my transaction, and that's going to be just my ID field right here. That comes from our new transaction trigger. There's a separate field that has the designations ID. So again, that's the unique ID for each split in the transaction, if it is a split transaction, or there'll be one for just that single designation if it's not a split. And then for our values, we're not mapping the fund from Bloomerang here. Instead, we are mapping the output from our lookup table. So again, following that conversion of our Bloomerang fund to our value IDs in Bloomerang. Now, what I'm going to do now is it's time for us to put in our code here that we are going to use. So I've got this over here on the left. And again, this is in the slide deck. So you'll get this following today's webinar, and we'll be able to copy and paste this into your own Zapier account in your own Zap. But I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste in my Zap. And so you can see when I come up here, there's two places here that have gray. You can see it says API key goes between quotations right here. And we need to replace the pound symbols with our field ID. And you can see in our slide deck, I'll show you what this looks like. So it actually calls it out for you a little bit. We've called out here where you're going to need to update the data that's in this script. So in this case, I'm going to go back to my script here, and I'm actually going to start with my field value ID. And you can leave the values or the grayed out text. It's not going to impact your code at all, but I'm going to come in here and I'm going to add my field value ID, which in this case is 8403968. So you can see I'm adding my ID for my field that I want to update. And then I'm going to come in and put my API key in here. And the only reason why you'll actually see me sharing my screen while I do this API key is that this is an API key I generated specifically for this webinar, and will be deactivating after today's webinar. And this is just to a sandbox Bloomerang instance. But you would come in and you would paste in your Bloomerang API key. As you can see, they're fairly lengthy string of numbers, letters, and hashes. But your API key, you'll come in and paste this in here. And that is all the updates that you should need to make to the script. So again, we've got our script here that we copy and pasted in. We added our API key. We added the field ID that we're wanting to update. And we can then go ahead and test our action. And again, the transaction that I pulled in here is a sample, because I love things being really transparent here on the call. This transaction here that we pulled in as our sample hasn't actually been coded in the GL code field. So when we test this here, is actually going to update that transaction, and then we will go into Bloomerang and look at it together, and I'll show you that where it coded those custom fields. I'm going to go ahead and test my action here. I clearly messed something up here. I must have copy and pasted wrong. Let's try that one more time. Well, apparently things always never quite go as planned. So we will troubleshoot this and make sure the script is correct when we send this over to you. Oh, that's where it is. I lost it. Perfect. Okay. Accidentally lost a comma in there. That's enough to do it. There we go. So that ran now. So if we go back to our Sherlock Gilchrist account, and we go to the timeline, he's got a split payment here from earlier this month. And you'll see that on this split payment now, that each of these transactions, and you can see that this even shows that it was updated today by our user, that each of these now has a value in the GL code field. So our capital fund is to the restricted, and then our unrestricted ones are coded to the unrestricted GL code. So again, a little bit more of an advanced use case here. We're using some scripting. There are variations of this script that can be used if you want to assign the same custom field value to all of the designations. Again, we're being more dynamic in this one and ensuring that this custom field is coded based off of a fund, campaign, or an appeal in Bloomerang. But just know there are other variations to this script that could be used for different use cases. So again, this is the specific use case of we want to dynamically code it based off of some other value in Bloomerang, a fund, a campaign, an appeal, and also having that support for if there are split transactions. We have variations for this if you're doing a single transaction or again, you want to assign the same value across all of your transactions. There's also ways to design a script in that manner too. I did see the one piece that was missing here, by the way, in this slide deck is there needs to be a comma here after this API key quotation. So we'll make sure that gets updated with Margie's team before they send this slide deck out so that you have the script that's going to have that in there and not cause the error we had just pop up. So we've got a couple minutes here, and there's one other use case that I want to highlight. We don't have time to demo it, but I think it's helpful to showcase this solution as it's one that can drastically reduce the amount of resource needed to send acknowledgements while still leveraging some of the acknowledgement functionality from within Bloomerang. So this is a way to do automated acknowledgements using Zapier. And this use case triggers like our other flows when a new transaction is created in Bloomerang. And what this automation does is it will send an acknowledgement out of a third-party tool. So whatever that desired service may be, it could be a physical mailed card through a service like Handwritten, or it could be an email sent through a transactional email tool like MailChimp or SendGrid. But essentially some way of automating that acknowledgement to go out. Once that acknowledgement is sent, the workflow creates an interaction in the constituents timeline in Bloomerang, logging that the acknowledgement was sent. And then the action to update the transaction in Bloomerang, what it actually does is there's a way we can update the acknowledgement fields on that transaction in Bloomerang to mark that the transaction was acknowledged and actually link the interaction that was created here earlier in the automation to reflect it as the acknowledgement that was sent. Again, similar to that functionality you may be doing currently in Bloomerang with its acknowledgement batch processing. The same thing can be done in automation if you prefer to send your acknowledgements out of a third-party service. Again, whether that's physical letters that are being mailed through that service or emails that are going out of another service. But this is a great use case, one we wanted to highlight. Again, we had an organization reach out about this recently and wanted to highlight it today, as it's another one that if this is something you're doing where you're sending acknowledgements or you want to automate sending acknowledgements outside of Bloomerang, it's a great one to be able to automate that process of marking those transactions as acknowledged in Bloomerang and linking that acknowledgement interaction to the transaction as well. So I want to go real quick. Looks like Aaron had a question. He said, can you say again why code is needed for this Zap? So that's a great question, Aaron. The reason why for this automation we need to use code is because the Bloomerang Zapier app doesn't currently have an action to update a transaction. So because there isn't that component in the Bloomerang Zapier app currently, we have to do a custom call to the Bloomerang API, which requires a code step. So it could also be structured using webhooks, but because of the dynamic nature of needing to do some of this support for the splits that you may have in a transaction, code is the best way for us to accomplish all that in a pretty short script for you to be able to implement. So again, in the future, this update transaction functionality may be something that's included in the Bloomerang Zapier app. It just isn't in there yet. So that's why we're using code for that. Awesome. So let's talk about getting started, and then I know we've got a couple other questions we should have some time for. So getting started with Bloomerang automations is pretty easy. The first step is really signing up for Zapier if you don't already have one. Zapier does start with a 14-day free trial, and following the free trial, your plan is converted to a free plan until you choose to upgrade. Most organizations need to upgrade to what's called Zapier's starter plan at a minimum in order to build multi-step Zaps. So Zapier's free plan only allows for one-step automations. None of the ones we showed today would be able to run under the free plan. So most organizations start with that starter plan. It's important to note that Zapier does provide a 15% nonprofit discount. So if you're a nonprofit and haven't applied for that discount yet, and you do have Zapier, I just went ahead and sent the link to that in the chat. I love reminding nonprofits that this is there and to take advantage of. So whether you currently have Zapier or if you plan to start using Zapier in the future, if you're a nonprofit, make sure to go ahead and apply for that additional discount as well. Now, after you sign up for Zapier, it's pretty simple to connect your Bloomerang database using the Bloomerang Zapier app. So again, you just go to the My Apps page, you add a connection, select Bloomerang, and then grant access using your Bloomerang login credentials. As we talked about earlier, we recommend setting up a user in Bloomerang that's labeled something generic like Zapier and uses an organizational email alias to ensure continuity in the face of staff turnover. If you're connecting using a specific user or a specific staff member's login credentials for Bloomerang, if their user is ever deactivated, that will also cause your connection in Zapier to drop as well. So something to be aware of there. If you prefer to build your automations DIY or really just want to learn more about Zapier, there are plenty of resources available, both about Zapier in general, as well as the Bloomerang Zapier app. Again, some of these are linked here. I know Margie sends these out as well in the follow-up email. And so you'll be getting links to all of these, but a lot of great resources out there to support you, whether you're looking to build your own Zaps or you're wanting to just learn more about Zapier. If your team would like support setting up a Bloomerang to Bloomerang automation, we do offer an integration bundle for Bloomerang customers. This includes end-to-end configuration and deployment of your automation. And this is a good fit for basic updates in Bloomerang, like the ones we talked about today. Pricing will vary for more complex solutions and use cases, but this is an optional service. Again, you absolutely can instead choose to implement your Bloomerang automations yourself in Zapier. We have many clients or many organizations on Bloomerang are doing this. We just want to let you know that if you'd like some support or would like someone to set up an automation for you, our team's available. Again, we have a bundle for more standard solutions. If you have a more complex use case, we're happy to talk through it and give you a custom proposal for what that would look like. Now, important to note, Zapier subscription is separate from this, so not included in this pricing. So while I address a couple of questions we've got here, Margie's going to go ahead and launch a poll. If you want help setting up an integration, or you just want to talk through a use case, or what tools you use in your tech stack and whether automation is possible, go ahead and reply in the poll and let us know you're interested in a follow-up, and we'll schedule a call just to talk through what your needs are and see if there's any way we can support you. Again, we love talking automations and we love talking Bloomerang automations. So any questions, again, please go ahead and mark that in the poll so that we know to follow up with you and answer any questions that you have. So it looks like Paul had a question. Does the transaction updating logic work with the Zapier transfer functionality, thereby enabling a bunch of existing Bloomerang transactions to be updated as a batch? So Paul, I don't know if the Zapier transfer functionality allows for code steps yet. The Zapier transfer functionality is still in beta, so they continue to roll out new functionality and expand the enhancements of that. It's possible that that may come in the future if it's not available right now, but definitely worth looking at and doing some testing on to see if that would work for you. And then looks like there was a question in the chat. I have so many things I want to zap. It's not been easy for me, not feeling intuitive. Again, great opportunity where if you just want to talk through what's possible, or how to integrate the things that you're using with Bloomerang, or again, Sidekick Solutions, we are Zapier certified experts, so we are not limited to integrations that involve Bloomerang. If you have other tools you're looking to integrate, again, we can help support that as well. So Megan, if you want to set up a call and we can talk through that, again, please let us know in the poll, or again, you can send us an email at Sidekick Solutions and we can get going on that. Tanya had the question, what resource is best for a newbie to Zapier and Bloomerang to begin? So Tanya, I would actually start with, if you haven't already watched the Exploring Bloomerang Automations in the Zapier 101 webinars, those I would say are the best place to begin because they cover Bloomerang, or they cover Zapier key concepts through the lens of Bloomerang automations. So again, the Exploring Bloomerang Automations and Zapier 101 are going to be great webinars. Tanya, we did send the links in the chat earlier, and Margie also, I believe, plans to send those in the follow-up email you'll get later today. So those will be coming later today. You also can search for them in Bloomerang Academy, and you can go ahead and find them there as well. But those are great webinars to start with. They're also on our Sidekick Solutions website as well. We have a Bloomerang page, and you'll see all of our Bloomerang and Zapier webinars listed there as well. Well, we're just coming up on time here. I don't think I see any questions, Margie. Did I miss any of them?
No, you did great. And this was such a great, helpful session. Thank you so much. And I noticed that people are commenting on the great tips you gave, and those are much appreciated. So Jesse, as always, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing all of this with us. You're getting some thank yous in the chat as well. So I'm going to close the poll, but real quickly, if you want to hop in and just indicate you want to follow up before I close it. But Jesse, thank you again, and we look forward to having you back for another Academy.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Margie, and thanks everyone for giving us an hour of your time today. Again, our door here is always open if you have questions or want some support with your Zapier automations.
Awesome. Thank you. And everyone, thank you so much for all the work you do in the community. Thanks for being with us, and we hope to see you back at Academy really soon. Everyone have a great day.